Hi, everybody. Oh, it got so quiet. That's so amazing. Please turn your cell phones off right now. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's program with Joyce Vance and Justin Leavitt. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 30th season. Thank you. You know, I really appreciate that you came out tonight because you could be at home comfortably watching Lawrence O'Donnell, where Joyce is clearly and unquestionably his favorite guest expert. And it's so easy to see why. Joyce explains really complex legal scenarios in a way so that non-lawyers like me can grasp not only the meat of the issue, but the nuance therein. It's a gift, and her law students at University of Alabama must love her for it. Her immensely popular Substack called Civil Discourse is much the same way. My cousin, who is here tonight, tells me that he won't get out of bed in the morning until he's done his spelling bee and read Civil Discourse. Why? Because she comments on what's going on in the law, and we're so much smarter after reading her columns. We're also smarter about what we need to do to save ourselves right now in this moment in American life. Joyce's new book, Giving Up Is Unforgivable, is like an expanded Substack of hers. Written so conversationally, this book reminds us that authoritarianism and autocracy can be really sneaky. She recognizes that we're tired and depressed, but in no way are we allowed to buckle to our impulses, to roll over and play dead. What I love is that she gives us clear marching orders and reasons why we have to do what she tells us to do. She isn't the only professor of law here tonight. We have Professor Justin Leavitt of Loyola Law here. He is a most distinguished scholar. His CV is so impressive. He specializes in civil rights and voting rights law. He served in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Remember when there was a Civil Rights Department in the Department? Okay. No wonder Joyce loves him. He also is in the Biden White House as their first senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights, devoted to racial justice and equity. What a thought. So here's what will happen tonight. God, I'm so grouchy after reading the paper this evening. Joyce and Justin will chat, and when they're through, you can ask brief questions. But those questions need a question mark at the end. No speeches. The mics are here in the aisle, and I remind you, please, no speeches. I'm the only one who gets to do that tonight. Joyce will sign copies of Giving Up Is Unforgivable after the program, and I love this book. It's a perfect gift for anyone who thinks about the importance of voting. It's my great pleasure to welcome Joyce Vance and Justin Leavitt.
These hot? Can y'all hear us?
Plenty. We don't need the mics, but yeah, we'll use the mics.
We
for
really
today.
don't. We're both very loud.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I have tonight the very distinct pleasure of talking to and introducing you all to one of my heroes. I had the pleasure to work with then U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance at the very end of the Loretta Lynch administration, where she told me all that a lawyer could be in the service of justice. We were both working for the department. Sometimes that department earns its name, sometimes less so. But Joyce was really, and has been really, one of the few people who understands every part of that role. In her service as a prosecutor, in her service as defending the United States, in her steadfast and vigorous commitment to civil rights then and always. She's really shown how to serve, and I think you all know she's been serving us all still ever since with the Substack and with her podcast and with her appearances, informing us all about what we need to know when we turn on the news, and now, most recently, in this little piece of magic. So I have the great pleasure to ask her a few questions and have her explain further to me tonight. I want to start.
Wait, no, I'm not going to let it go. A, he's trying to embarrass me.
It's working, though.
And it is. And B, most of what I learned, I actually learned from you, because you're soft-pedaling your own role in the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department, leading us as we looked at voting rights sort of issues. So a lot of what I talk about in the book is actually stuff that we worked on and that I learned from you, which makes this a special night for me and a great chance to talk with all of you about some of the work we did together.
It is a special night. It's fun. And we don't get the chance to see each other as often as we'd like. So I want to thank all of you for bringing Joyce back home to Los Angeles, where she grew up. The reason we're going to talk about you is you've written a book.
That's true.
And so I want to start with a quote from that book. I want to use this time to talk generally about how we got into this mess and how we can get out. That is very much how you have organized the book, about how we got into this mess, and hopefully, with hope throughout, how we can get out of it. You say in the book, frustration with institutions that don't perform effectively is legitimate, but it's important to get the diagnosis right. Often it's the people who populate them who are flawed, and not the institutional framework itself. And riddled throughout this book, you find deep, bone-deep respect for institutions and what they can bring, and what they represent in people working side by side together to achieve something, and also recognition that the institutions are only ever the people that inhabit them, and only as good as that. But a deep respect for the institutions that serve us, or that are supposed to serve us. And primarily, you see in the book over and over again, a deep and abiding respect for the courts. Make sense? You're a lawyer and a law professor. I'm a lawyer and a law professor. That checks out. Go ahead. You were going to intercede.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting that you seized on this, because if you had asked me 10 years ago if I was an institutionalist, I would have told you no. And I remember the criticism of Bob Mueller, former U.S. attorney, former FBI director, when he was the special counsel conducting the Mueller investigation. And there were people who said that he was too deeply respectful of the institutions, that he should have ignored, for instance, the guidance in the Justice Department that you couldn't indict a sitting president. And for those of us who had worked in the Justice Department, we knew exactly what Bob was trying to do. He wanted to make sure that he didn't destroy the institutions in the process of trying to hold the president accountable. So he was doing things that many people questioned, moving too slowly, being too deferential to the then president, permitting Trump, for instance, to answer questions in writing instead of sitting for a deposition. All that stuff that at the time seemed a little bit, questionable. Why is this happening? And I just remember the criticism of the institutions, and when it suddenly dawned upon me that it was, in fact, the people in the White House, right? Some of these folks who were flawed, and that at the same time, some of the institutions had folks who were just magnificent. The Defense Department, the folks at the end of the Justice Department who refused to let DOJ be used to perpetrate the myth of voter fraud in the 2020 election. And so I realized what we need to work on is the people. What we need to do is not destroy the institutions. And that thought was a lot of what animated this.
And it's very present throughout the book. So a challenge to you. I'm a lawyer and a law professor too, and I too have tremendous respect for institutions. It's part of the training. It's part of how we came up and exist in the world. right now, people are seeing some institutions fail, and not just the ones with temporary personnel. The Supreme Court in particular is behaving badly.
Such an understatement.
So how can you help those who don't happen to be lawyers and you don't happen to have that training in the value of the institution see the value of courts led by a Supreme Court that doesn't have rotating personnel, that has personnel that are there for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a tough question, right? I'm a lawyer. I'm the daughter-in-law of a federal judge. Respect for the courts is pretty deeply ingrained in my DNA. And it would never have occurred to me that I would live to find a moment where I just don't have respect for the majority on the Supreme Court. That's so difficult. It's so hard. You sort of have to confront that before you can move forward. But, you know, the pitch that I would make is this. Let's set aside the Supreme Court for just a second and talk about the lower federal courts, because they are performing magnificently. There are federal district judges across the country in places like Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, who are doing their jobs completely without fear, knowing that Donald Trump may well stick a bullet on their back, right? Might lead to their doxing just for doing their jobs. And they are doing it anyhow. And I think that they need our thanks and our support. I heard earlier this week about some folks, you know, the people that write postcards to voters in other states, right? Now there are people writing postcards to federal judges, thanking them for their service. What a great idea. I'm not very artistic, but I'm going to get out my glue and my colored pencils and do some of that when I get home. So I think that there's that. The courts aren't dysfunctional. The institution isn't broken. The problem is what's happening in the Supreme Court. You know, a court that was happy to tell a president that he need not fear criminal prosecution for anything that he did while in office, which I think in the future will be viewed as a tragic misstep by this court. Again, there are politics involved, right? The courts aren't supposed to be part of politics, but Donald Trump is, I think, very enamored with what used to be a fringe conservative theory called the unitary executive. The idea that the presidency should be much more powerful than it's been in the post-Nixon era. And if you go back and read the Founding Fathers and look at the Federalist Papers, something that I sort of did extensively when I was writing the book, you get this remarkable sense that they were living, breathing human beings. They lived a long time ago. They feel very real to me when I read them talking about the importance of having 3 branches of government and a separation of power and preventing factions, because they created this government in response to a king, right? They didn't want to live under the rules of kings anymore. Their animating sort of guiding star was, how do we make sure that no one so powerful that they can boss us around emerges again? And so that's the whole idea that they have when they're developing 3 branches. This notion that the presidency should be so powerful that the president can fire anybody he wants to in the executive branch, can destroy agencies created by Congress, can, you know, pass out pardons to people who have done him favors. I mean, I could go on and on deep into the kleptocracy. This is something that the Supreme Court has bought in on. And they're now at the point where they run the risk of making themselves irrelevant. Because there are cases in front of the court, the National Guard cases are a great example, where the White House is saying to the court, judicial review is off the table. You can no longer review decisions that are made by the president and decide if they're constitutional or not. And you know, I don't like to read tea leaves. I wonder what your take is on this. But they've just taken this case where Justice Barrett seems to have strongly suggested in the questions that they're asking the lawyers to brief that they believe that they have the ability to engage in judicial review, and they're going to move on to substantive questions in these cases, which is a really great sign for democracy, right? Because if you've got Amy Coney Barrett, then you really only need one more justice. And I gotta believe that there are Supreme Court justices who don't want to be irrelevant, right? They don't want to be the court that writes itself out of a job. That's not a really engaging or, it's not a happy moment to say that, right? But I think at bottom, this court will stand up for itself, if not for anybody else. What that does is, it's not supposed to be a laugh line, y'all. I think that gives us the opportunity to get to the midterm elections. And if we get to the midterm elections, and if there's a majority of right-thinking people in the Senate, we can prevent any more really bad nominees to the Supreme Court. And then we can start to think about some of these powerful reform notions, things that should just be obvious, like adopting an ethics code for the court, but also real talk about term limits for justices, or maybe expanding the court to be parallel the number of circuits. There are good ideas out there. And so, to the point of your question, this is why we should have confidence in the institutions and support them, because if we kill off the institutions, then there will be nothing left that we can turn to protect us from the risk of a king or an autocrat taking power. So it's really a weird moment where you have to hate the institutions and love them at the same time.
This is why I love talking to Joyce, because there is no end of follow-up material.
That's not a good thing when it's you doing the questioning.
That's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. Let me ask about the Supreme Court, and I think you're right that they don't want to make themselves irrelevant. Have they made themselves too relevant? They've taken on an awful lot of power and authority. They've decided that they are the deciders. Have they put themselves in the mix as a campaign issue for 2026, for 2028, for some of the reforms that you mentioned that might bring the court back to size a little bit?
Yeah, I think that they absolutely have. Did you guys know the names of all of the justices 10 years ago? Did you know about Sam Alito's wife's flag-flying habits? This stuff has all become common parlance now, and I think that's a very good insight. I think the court, frankly, when it decides cases this term, will give at least a little bit of thought to the way that it might impact the midterm elections, and that may be a moderating force. I don't love the fact that politics and the courts are intersecting, right? The Chief Justice's job is to keep politics out of the court, but this is a Chief Justice who's done that at the margins and not in the middle, and so the court is absolutely a live issue.
Yeah, I always thought that his metaphor, the balls and strikes metaphor, was far more apt than most people recognized. We're sitting here in the middle of a World Series, and as you all know, an umpire calls balls and strikes, but also decides where the strike zone is. And if you change the strike zone, you change the game. If you change the strike zone just for one team, you change the game a lot. And if you change the strike zone just for one team while you're wearing the other team's colors, you get people to tune out the game entirely. And so I think his metaphor of being an umpire was spot on. It's just that he didn't realize what part he was playing in that game.
I told y'all he was good.
So I'll take the applause. So I also loved in the last answer to the last question that you brought up the Federalist Papers, and they also infuse the book. They are common characters throughout. I think it's a wonderful thing that you've made them accessible to people to read as if they were op-eds, which is what they were. The Federalist Papers were sales pitches for the Constitution, and if you read them, just read them as op-eds, start to finish, they are remarkably accessible, persuasive devices, and you've given us sort of a feel for that here.
I'm going as Federalist 10 for Halloween this year.
And I would support that. I would give you all of the candy. The Federalist Papers set out this separation of powers that is laboring at the moment. You say in the book, when one branch of government is out of whack, our system is designed so that another branch can keep us afloat until that balance is restored. And I don't want to give away the ending. You all have to buy the book and read the book. But there's a postscript that suggests that the court may be out of whack and that Congress may be out of whack. And so the question, what do we do when they're all out of whack?
I mean, this is the issue, right? The Founding Fathers clearly contemplate one branch going pear-shaped. And they maybe think about the possibility of some issues in a second branch. I'm not sure that they fully anticipated a moment like this where the president is trending towards authoritarianism. The Congress says, oh, let us be supine. You know, we'll just show you our belly and do whatever you want. And the court says, you know, let us put our thumb on the scale of justice for you. That really leaves two, maybe a few more institutions for us to rely on. One is the press, which is a super interesting question. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with traditional media. And there are examples in the book, and we see examples every day of reporters, even at some of these media outlets that we've become less than happy with, who are doing incredibly instrumental reporting that, for instance, helps us see what's happening at the Department of Defense, even after the Pentagon press pool has been kicked out of the Pentagon, right? So there are real heroes in the press. But the answer, when you've got 2.5 branches that are down, it really does turn out to be us. I mean, the reality is cavalry is not coming. No one is going to save us. It will be up to us to rally enough of our friends and neighbors that as we head into the midterms, and it's going to have to be a marathon, not a sprint, that we think very deliberately about the election. The important thing about the election is this. I hope this isn't a question that you were going to ask. I get asked a lot if there are going to be elections in 2026 and 2028. And the answer is absolutely there will be elections, because would-be dictators like nothing better than the aura of legitimacy that being able to say that they were duly elected gives them, right? It's why Vladimir Putin still has elections in Russia. Even though he's killed off the opposition, then he can say, ooh, I was elected. So Trump will hold elections at the midterms. The question is, will they be free and fair? And because we have 50 state elections by the grace of God and the Founding Fathers and not one national one, that means that we can exert a lot of control over what our state elections look like. Y'all are doing that here right now, voting on Proposition 50. And that's happening across the country. Every place that there's an effort to constrain elections, in Maine, where they have a measure on the ballot that would take away absentee voting and force them to vote like we do in Alabama, where you just have to go on the one day. Whatever commitments you have, you've got to set them aside and go wait in a 3-hour-long line if you really want to vote, which a lot of people do. And that's the secret going into 2026, for us to do whatever we have to do to make it possible for everyone to vote.
So that wasn't a question I was going to ask, but I'm delighted by the answer. I think...
Do you agree?
I do. I 100% do, for a slightly different reason. I don't think the elections will happen because Donald Trump wants them to happen. I think they'll happen because he can't stop them from happening.
Yeah.
And I think that's incredibly important for us to remember. So I had the privilege of serving in the White House as a senior advisor on democracy and voting rights. And most of the time that I spent there was on democracy, not on voting rights, because the president doesn't really do that. We spend a lot of time not doing, because it's not the president's job and not the president's power. Now, I know the president, this president, has thrown a lot of influence around, has exerted a lot of influence out of things that aren't his job or aren't his power. But that's because he's got his fingers on a lot of switches. Congress made those decisions. Those are dangerous decisions. But Congress said the president has the authority to affect the economy. The president has the authority to utilize the military. The president has the authority over the immigration system. He's not supposed to use it like he's using it, but he's got that authority. He doesn't have that authority over elections. Your elections, our elections, I'm here in LA too, will happen on Tuesday, have been happening for the last month, because local officials have set them up and are holding them. And that will happen in 26, and that will happen in 28. And that's true in every community around the country, and there is literally nothing the president can do to stop that other than convince us that he's got magical powers he does not have. The biggest threat to the 26 and 28 elections, and this comes right back to a theme that you bring up over and over in the book, is that he gets not to the election structure, not to the mechanics, not to whether we are able to cast ballots or not. He gets to us. He hacks us. He gets us to believe that it's too dangerous or too scary or too fraught or too difficult or too not worth it to be able to vote. And I'm going to get to the part of the book that does this in just a second. The book has a magnificent set of recommendations to help us remember that voting is none of those things, that we actually have exactly the power that you talk about, and that's why the 26 and 28 elections will happen, is because we want them to happen. And he can't change that unless we let him. And I don't think Joyce is willing to let him.
You know, it's a good bet. Something that we used to talk about a lot, you may be the first person who said this to me, I'm not certain, is they wouldn't be trying to take your right to vote away so hard and so fast if it wasn't incredibly powerful. So when we talk about the collapse of the courts, right, or our desire to see a Congress that will actually fulfill its constitutional obligations, voting is the right that unlocks all of the other rights. They understand that. That's why they're not only trying to make it difficult for folks to vote, they're trying to convince you to give up that right voluntarily, to relinquish it. And this is the tactic of a strong man. My friend Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who many of you may be familiar with because she appears on Rachel Maddow's show a lot, Rachel calls Ruth whenever she wants someone to talk about how do dictators operate. And something that Ruth always shares is that dictators try to overwhelm people into submission. They try to make you believe that their success is inevitable and that there's no way to outrun them. And Donald Trump is really good at that. If he has a skill set, it's convincing people that he will prevail and that there is nothing that you can do about it. The elections, your vote isn't going to count anyhow. So why should you go to all the trouble of voting? Just stay home and let it go, right? That's Donald Trump's narrative, and that's why it's so important for us to try to reclaim that and to realize that at bottom, we are the institution that matters. All of us, our ability to do whatever it takes to vote. You know, I think the one place that we differ on this is I worry a lot about Donald Trump's ability to do things that we all look at each other and shake our heads and say, that's illegal. He can't do that. Like, who would have ever thought that the Supreme Court would sign off on a president using SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival? But that's where we end up after the criminal immunity case. It still boggles my mind. And what Trump does, he's very skillful at this, is he acts first. He waits for somebody to tell him no. And when you're waiting on the courts, that can take a little bit of time. So I fear that we might see some sort of an effort to outrun the courts. We need to be armed with the knowledge that we've shared tonight, this notion that presidents don't have a role to play. Because oftentimes Trump will back down if he's pushed quickly and immediately and told the states run elections. People get to vote. Their votes get counted. Who you vote for, that's a political choice. But your right to vote, that's an American essential. And so no matter who you are as a political candidate, you simply must allow people the right to vote. That's really the consensus in our communities that we desperately need to develop with all of our friends and neighbors and family in these next months.
So the notion of Donald Trump as inevitable is a notion that you mentioned in the book. The youngest generation now engaged in politics believes because they've never known anything different. He's been a presidential candidate for 10 years of their life, or president, and that's a long political memory. And before that is only distant haze. And I know you've got kids who are in that zone, and so this is, personal as well as prophetic. I know you're writing the book in part for them, but not only for them. I sense an audience beyond the youngest generation. How do you either help people understand or help people remember that there was a time and a politics before Donald Trump, and can be a time and a politics that isn't Donald Trump?
You know, I think this is so difficult. I tell this story in the book of my 22-year-old. And I asked him, I was writing the book, and I said, Ollie, what would it take to get you to read a book about democracy?
Brave question.
Right? I mean, his eyes sort of glazed over. He's such a sweet child. Like, he never wants to hurt my feelings. And he was just like, no, not happening. And so we had this conversation that I relate in the book where he finally says to me, you know, Mom, democracy has never worked in my lifetime. Donald Trump is the first president that I knew. And I said, but, you know, we need to go out and protest. We need to fix it. And he said, I was 4 years old when Occupy happened, and nothing has changed. Wealthy business interests still control this country. Democracy doesn't work. And that child is the poster child for the mission that we have in front of us, which is convincing them that democracy is vital. So I spend a lot of ink, I spill a lot of ink in the book talking about this. Something that we have to do is be really intentional about talking with people in his age range. You know, civics education in schools is great. I have a lot of students who tell me, I had civics in 4th grade and that was it. I was hooked, I was in love. But not everybody falls into that bracket, and they need this sort of real-world engagement in civics to drive the point home. So if you've got kids who care about climate change, talk with them about the ability that we have to impact pro-climate change or climate change amelioration policies if we have elected representatives who have to be responsive to us, even if they're not perfectly responsive, right? A lot of good things that were happening up until the installment of this administration happened because even elected leaders for whom climate change wasn't their top priority felt the need to be responsive to the people that were electing them. And what happens when you have a dictator in the White House who's worried only about wealthy friends and business interests? You're not going to make progress on climate change. So I have found that laying that out, I mean, it sounds sort of boring, right? You have to buy them food to have this conversation with them.
Or put them in a book.
Well, that's true, right? I mean, he signed off on it. I didn't do it without asking. But I mean, it's not easy is the point that I want to make. And the fact that it's not easy doesn't mean that we get to give up and walk away from it. We have to constantly be talking to this generation because they don't start from the same baseline that my generation does, where we deeply believe that democracy matters and is important. You know, it's the old Winston Churchill line, right? Democracy is the worst form of government ever tried except for all of the other ones. We all get that, and they don't. And so I think talking with them, illustrating for them, really matters. You know, we know the political scientists who discussed and studied the reemergence of Eastern European nations from communism said that formal education about democracy, formal civics education matters. But what matters even more is experience with democracy, whether that's taking your kids or your grandkids to vote with you, or whether that's taking them to observe local politics, which is really some of the most fascinating politics in our country, right? My mayor decided today in Birmingham, Alabama, to take $1 million out of our emergency slush fund to make sure that no one in Birmingham would go hungry when SNAP ends. And so this same child who knows the mayor was the one who sent me that and said, look at what Randall's doing. This is really great. And I said, sugar, that's democracy in action.
I want to bring Ellie into this conversation too. I want to highlight something that you talked about just there, and that is civics education, but in a way, I think a wonderfully expansive way. We share this, absolutely. Yeah. That isn't the way that I think most people think about civics education. They think about it in terms of 4th or 5th grade, and you learn there are 3 branches of government, and we learn who the Supreme Court justices are, and now we're done. Or you watch my generation watched How a Bill Becomes a Law and the rest of Schoolhouse Rock, and then we're
so
done.
good.
And you talk about it very differently. You talk about what educators think of as action civics, of civics by doing and not just learning about, but hands-on, book clubs and going to museums and taking your kid with you when you go to vote. And it produces not only your kid sending you the latest news about the mayor and what he's doing to backstop SNAP benefits, but a truly delightful conversation on a trampoline that I would hope, if I'm not giving away one of the best parts of the book, I would hope you could tell people about. How does action civics and really getting engaged in the work of civics education, of doing civics, help people live those values?
You know, it's always a bummer when you learn really important things from your kids and then you have to tell them how brilliant and smart they are, right? But this is one of those experiences with my daughter. I think something that happened to all of us was that we began to take democracy for granted. We didn't think it would ever really be in question, right? I mean, the 250th anniversary seemed preordained in a way that maybe now it doesn't seem. And so I think we stopped keeping it in the center of our lives. Not to say that it's the most important thing going on in everybody's world, but we didn't celebrate it in a real way. We took it for granted, we criticized it, we talked about gridlock in Congress, we were sometimes not full of respect for elected officials who maybe didn't personally deserve that respect, but the offices that they held deserved respect, and we got a little bit away from that. I think one of the ways that we come back is then by restoring democracy. So lawyers, primarily lawyers, celebrate something called Law Day, a federal holiday that you may never have heard of, but on Law Day, lawyers go out and they meet and people give speeches about the value of the rule of law, and it's really very wonderful. At least in Alabama, in my local bar, it's an important, meaningful day, and the lawyers go out and read to school kids. But it's just one day. And I think my basic idea is that we need to have Law Day every day, where we take advantage of the opportunity to talk about democracy. And so on the occasion that Justin is referring to, my daughter, who was maybe 4, 5, 6 at the time, manages to get her 2 older brothers, her younger brother, and me on the family trampoline in the backyard, where she proceeds to lecture us about her favorite holiday, Martin Luther King Day. And why, I'm wondering, has Eleanor seized on this day? But she's good, and she knows about the letter from a Birmingham jail, and she's talking about how important it is to treat people the same no matter what their skin color is. And she's really got some dicey comments for people who think skin color matters any more than hair color does. And she's sort of going on. And I finally realize what's happening. My kid has been going to church with her dad. My husband goes to this really wonderful, it's called the Fellowship Breakfast. And it's a group of people who circulate through all of the historic black churches in Birmingham. Bob used to describe it as, I love my religion with really good food and a side of political conversation. And I mean, it's a lot of fun. Now there are fewer of them. Many of them are sadly beginning to die out, but it used to be a lot of foot soldiers, people who marched in Birmingham, who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And the wisdom that would get casually shared with you on a Sunday morning over a really good plate of food was just fabulous. I used to always love going with him, and Ellie used to go with him every Sunday. They, of course, made a huge fuss over her, and she had absorbed the lesson about the importance of Martin Luther King, and even more importantly, she had absorbed Dr. King's message about equality, and she wanted to share that with me and her brothers, and she did, sort of ad nauseum. But it was really, I mean, we all remember it. I asked the boys, I was like, do you remember that day Ellie got us on the trampoline? And they all remembered it, which was very surprising to me because it was a long time ago and they were young. So we still celebrate Dr. King's Day in our house. We always read the letter from a Birmingham jail. It's not just another Monday holiday. And I feel like we could use a lot more of that in our society. I get that saying that gives you the risk of sounding a little bit silly, but why not embrace democracy? Why not talk about Dr. King, who could just as easily have rejected a democracy that did not want to include him, and instead embraced it and talked with people about supporting it and making it better instead of abandoning it?
As the kids say, that sounds cringe, but democracy is full of
Right?
tiny little cringe moments, and they are glorious.
I literally emailed my editor after I wrote that section, and I was like, Nick, this is pretty cringy. Should I just take it out? And
Not
he was
for a
like,
moment.
no, leave it in. Yeah.
That is absolutely correct. That's how we do us, is we keep reminding ourselves of that. There was a quote attributed to Plato, but who knows, up at the top of the pediment of the main Justice Building in DC that I know Joyce walked through many a time.
Yeah.
And it said, justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first it resides in the hearts and souls of the citizens. It's true of democracy too. And the education that we're able to give our kids and our colleagues and our friends and our family and our extended family, not just through classes, but through living the sort of democratic engagement, through living civics, is what makes it possible to live in the hearts and souls of citizens. That's how we do it.
And it still sounds a little bit, soupy when you say it, right? I mean, I think if you've worked at the Justice Department like we've had, and we've had this conversation before, I mean, you don't really say it out loud because you're afraid people will think that you're being a little bit silly. But if you cut either one of us, we still bleed Justice Department blue, right? I mean, once you've taken the oath, you have that obligation to serve your community for the rest of your life. I think we need to try to get outside of our own bodies, set aside the fact that we sometimes feel a little bit silly and patriotic and cringy when we do this, and just claim this space. Because the way we got into this mess was by letting democracy get pushed off to the side. It's okay to embrace it.
And I'll tell you, if you want a tiny little spicy piece of that drug, the best way to find it is to go talk to somebody after they've just voted for the first time, or after they voted for the first time after they couldn't. Talk to somebody who was disenfranchised and has been re-enfranchised. Talk to somebody who is a new 18-year-old voter. Talk to somebody who's a new citizen and voting for the first time, and you will see the gift. We don't designate officials based on polls, and we wouldn't even if the polls were perfect every single time, because there is a gift in the act of building us through democracy. And that feeling that you get from talking to somebody who has been told you're a part of this now is absolutely unbeatable. It's a way to make sure that you get a very small piece of that flavor, and it's accessible to everyone in this room whenever you choose to remember that feeling.
It is, and if you really want to feel good about yourself in the upcoming election, find someone who's never voted before and take them with you, right? I mean, it's sort of like you never want to go to a party alone. Do you ever get that feeling? Or you need the invitation? So extend that invitation to a first-time voter and help them figure out how to register, how to stay registered, how do they figure out where their precinct is, how do they educate themselves about the candidates, how do they follow up and make sure that their ballot gets counted. And being there and walking them through every step, if you're looking for something that you can do, adopt a young voter or a new voter and do that with them, and everybody benefits from it.
And you have the opportunity to do that tomorrow, and Saturday, and Sunday, and Monday, and Tuesday. You don't. Most of the places that Joyce is on this tour, you got to wait a couple months before you actually do. You get to do that this weekend if you want. You write in the book about the protests and the remarkable feeling of seeing signs that said due process and rule of law out in the streets. And you say seeing that was a remarkable development in a country where for so long the common political wisdom was that Americans cared about kitchen table issues, not democracy itself. Is democracy itself now a kitchen table issue?
I mean, I think that it's the only conclusion that we can reach. But look, the pundits, the political consultants, still really err on the side of telling their candidates, run on the economy, run on kitchen table issues, run on people's pocketbooks, because that's what voters vote about. I'm not a political consultant, and I don't pay one on TV. But I do talk to a lot of voters in a lot of places all across the country. And I think what we saw in the protests, people hold, who ever thought Americans would hold signs that said due process? But we all understand now that if people who don't have legal status to be in this country are denied their due process, that we are all at risk. We're watching American citizens now being detained by ICE, in some cases for 24 hours, in some cases being treated extremely harshly. Due process matters for everybody. It doesn't check your passport first to see if you're a citizen. And so, to the point of your question, right, is democracy now a kitchen table issue? It is in some ways because it impacts people's pocketbooks. We're seeing right now what happens when you have a president who's capable of acting arbitrarily and capriciously, and what violation of democracy, for instance, by imposing tariffs that aren't authorized by the statutory sort of hook he's trying to use for it. That hurts all of us, right? But I think that there's still more to it. I think Americans are waking up again to the notion that democracy is a value in and of itself, that due process matters, that it's essential to who we are as people, that we don't want to be a country where we see, jackbooted thugs walking through American streets enforcing the law. It's deeply ingrained that the military doesn't enforce laws on American streets against American civilians, barring some sort of utterly unusual situation like 1992 here and the Rodney King riots, right? That's the sort of case where a president might bring in military forces at the request of a governor and mayor. But the idea that a president can do that because he wants to, when the governor is saying no and the mayor is saying no and the people in that city are just dressing up in unicorn costumes, and suddenly the president decides to bring in troops, I think democracy is front and center. And maybe that's wishful thinking. We'll find out in the course of this election cycle. In 2024, not enough Americans were willing to come out and vote for democracy. And there were wedge issues that were used to divide Americans and to convince some people, too many of them, to stay home. They were told that staying home was a way that they could impact the political process. And they have learned, and we have learned, and the polls are now showing that people understand that voting is essential. It's a long time between now and the midterm elections, and Americans have short memories and are notoriously fickle. That means that we have to all keep having the conversations. Remember what it felt like when you realized that you were going to lose your job because you voted for a president who didn't care about federal employees, right? Remember what it felt like when you lost your SNAP benefits because the president and the vice president, who was fed by the government as a kid, didn't think that you mattered. We have got to keep having those conversations and sticking the knife in.
Gonna need a lot more inflatable unicorn costumes.
We are. I mean, if I go as Federalist 10 for Halloween, will you go as an inflatable unicorn?
Yeah, already sold. All right, last question from me before I turn the questions over to these wonderful people. You're speaking in many ways to people who are already interested. They are not, as Thomas Paine criticized, they are not your summer soldiers or sunshine patriots. They are, I have a sense, committed members of the democracy team. How can you best equip them to spread the civic gospel?
So I'm going to speak carefully because one of my cousins is here. We had the experience in our family that I bet many of y'all have had of having some family members who were willing to flirt with MAGA. And that was tough because we love our family. What we found was the best thing that we could do in that situation, was to try to draw circles that were big enough for everybody to stand on, because there were fundamental principles that we could all agree upon. We were just seeing things differently. And then we just tried to plant seeds a little bit at a time, knowing that they would take root and that they would grow. And in many cases they have, right? Because we live, I hate the word unprecedented. We use it all the time. It's overused. It nonetheless is the right word. It's unprecedented times where bad things happen to good people who never saw them coming, and where people who still feel protected and insulated from the worst abuses of this administration understand that bad things are happening to people that they care about, or that maybe there's an empty seat in their kid's classroom and one of their kids' friends isn't there anymore because ICE has come for him or his family. So, look, we can't be afraid to have these conversations, especially now. I mean, I have a feeling Thanksgiving is going to be lit in a lot of people's houses this year. It's a moment to be bold. You don't have to intentionally piss people off. You should be a truth speaker. And there are little details, like the detail about J.D. Vance's family existing on Snap, that are powerful. Or there are, for instance, places like Alabama, where many people are deeply religious and participate in church programs where they drive people who don't have legal status to be in this country to doctor's appointments. And they've now learned that that conduct will be criminalized, and they can be sent to jail for doing what they believe is their religious obligation. So we need to find the circles that are big enough for all of us to stand on. But it takes patience. Don't pretend it's going to happen immediately. Don't think that you personally have to shoulder the entire burden of fixing what's broken. You don't. We'll do it together. The most important thing that I know comes from the civil rights community, and it's this. You should be in community when you face big problems like this. You don't have to face them alone. Face them in community and have confidence that if we each do whatever it is that's in front of us. I've had this incredible blessing of getting to speak to people on television, through the media, in podcasts. And honestly, it soothes my soul. It makes me feel like I'm doing whatever I can do. And how that looks for you might be really different. It might be writing postcards to voters in another state. It might be volunteering with the League of Women Voters. It might be writing songs or poems that inspire people. And whatever flavor your opportunity and your passion takes you in, if you do that and the folks sitting on either side of you do their thing, we will find a way to get through it as long as we all stay together in community on this.
That's worth the applause. All right, so now I want to invite you all to be in community with us. I will say I'm a law professor. I am used to hearing things that start sounding like questions and then veer into something else. So I'm going to ask if you have a question. We welcome profoundly questions. We are less friendly toward other types of things.
Oh,
but please.
I love that. You've done my work for me. Thank you. Okay, remember, no speeches, questions, and make them brief.
We are merciless as law professors about doing this, but it does let us get to more questions. So thank you for your understanding.
I'll be brief. First, thank you so very, very much. I read you either every night or every morning before I go to bed. I'm from the civil rights generation, and I remembered Martin Luther King, et cetera. I also write Agnostic Patriot on Substack, and I have to throw. But my question is, okay, go through the possibility that the Supreme Court is about to say that Donald Trump is, what he's doing is non-reviewable. How bad could it get? Could he bomb a city?
If the Supreme Court says that there's no more judicial review of the president's actions, we're in an extremely dark place. I don't think that we're going to get there. I have worried, I will tell you. I mean, this court, I don't have a good crystal ball for, but we've seen this recent activity that we talked about with Justice Barrett, and what it suggests is the court is past the question of whether or not it can review the president's actions, and they're on to the substance of those actions. So take heart from that. I don't like to speculate about how bad it could get. What I would rather do is think about how are we prepared to deal with a problem with the courts. Because at that point, you know, right now, we're getting a lot of mileage out of the lawyers going to courts. Blue states attorneys general are they're just doing the heavy lifting for this moment. You know, Rob Bontis, your attorney general, is a leader in that. There are others across the country. And we have lawyers, many of our friends, lawyers like Norm Eisen, who has been leading this sort of effort. And so I would prefer to focus on how do we evolve that if we find that the courts are less friendly. And we're not out of answers, right? We have activism, we have ourselves, we have the ballot.
I'll also say, I'll just add 30 seconds to that. One, the courts, as Joyce said before, the lower courts are doing a marvelous job so far. Republican and Democratic, and neither, have been looking at law, have been looking at facts, and doing things that are recognizable as court cases. Even when there have been interventions, even when there have been military interventions, I look to our experience here in LA as showing the limits. Donald Trump wants to project power more than he needs to exercise it. There was a magnificent infographic when the National Guard was deployed to LA not that long ago that set the stages of unrest. And I don't want to minimize anybody that was caught up in the raids, and I don't want to minimize anybody that happened to run into the military. But the thermometer started up at the top of the '92 Rodney King uprising, and then slightly below that was shopping at the Trader Joe's Silver Lake on a weekend, and then slightly below that was trying to get out of the Hollywood Bowl after a concert, and slightly below that was shopping at the Glendale Galleria around Christmas time, and then slightly below that was the level of unrest and disquiet caused by the military presence here. And that's important to remember, because we are many and we are big. And it's really hard. It's easy to project power onto that, but it's really hard to exercise power in the face of that.
Can I just say one more thing? I promise we'll get to more questions. The other thing that we are is we are much more joyous, right? I mean, the guy in the
Inflatable
White
unicorns.
House is not happy. Hang on to your happiness in these moments.
Thank you very much. An informed electorate is required. How do we, I know that political speech is protected, but why are lies? And lies to a consumer. We are, as an electorate, consumers. There's this Consumer Protection Agency, there's FCC. Why is this allowed? I'm sorry, thank you.
It's a great question.
It really is. You know, we strike some interesting constitutional balances in this country, and one of the most important ones is around the First Amendment, where we choose, unlike other countries, to elevate free speech, which does exactly what you're talking about, right? It sets us up. In Finland, they have this fabulous program for educating school children to detect disinformation and misinformation. And it's taught not as a separate class, but it's taught in every class. I write about it a little bit in the book. And so children instinctively from an early age question, who's writing? What axe might they have to grind? What do they hope to get out of this? So that they're not accepting things at face value. And one of the teachers who's discussed in the study that I looked at said something that I think is so powerful. She said, I want them to understand that just because an idea is pleasant or appealing to them, that doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And so this idea that we should question, you know, we don't have that sort of education in this country, but again, if you believe in reforming civics education, this could be a big part of it, and we need to do more reality testing on our politicians across the spectrum, because y'all, the New York Times no longer has a fact checker who's doing it for us, right? But you can listen to Donald Trump, and when he talks to you about how Biden was influencing criminal investigations that happened when Donald Trump was in the White House with his nominees running the Justice Department, that's a pretty easy one to debunk. It's a great opportunity to talk with people around us. But I love your question because I think it signifies something that I worry about a lot, which is the fact that we need to take this up as a mission and really make ourselves a country that's just better at debunking BS when it's thrown at us.
And one way to do that is something that Joyce also talks about in the book, but differently. We've had disinformation and misinformation as long as we've had information. It has been forever and always. And one of the dangers of having the government decide what information is good information, you can anticipate if we had this government is attempting to decide what information is good information. I'm not sure I'm in love with that. But it turns out that the information problem we have might not be a misinformation problem, but a loneliness and connection problem. The Surgeon General, the prior Surgeon General, talked a lot about this, that we actually, in community with each other, real people, not online, when we actually talk to each other, it turns out that we collectively have pretty good BS detectors amongst ourselves and ways to check each other, including at Thanksgiving. And so it might be that one of the ways out of this is the education element you talk about in Finland, but another way out of this is just means to find connection with other people, to talk about, to have hard conversations about things so that we can check ourselves.
Yeah, that's such a great point, right? Once somebody says, oh, look at Trump's tweet, he was the president, not Joe Biden when this happened, then everything, all the cylinders start to click. We really are better together than we are separately, if there's a lesson here.
Not tall enough. I'm relieved to hear you both say that you think we will have elections in 26 and 28. That's great to hear. What happens and how great is your fear that Donald Trump and his minions will try to reject the results of the election? And if they do that, what do we do?
So if they lose elections at the midterms, especially in key places, key senators, key congressional districts, we're going to see some of that in 2025 right now as they're sending out monitors to California and other places. Donald Trump will absolutely float a narrative that there's fraud. And look, the argument that I thought in 2020 was the most powerful argument that should have been made much more strongly than it was. I don't know, maybe you heard this more than I did, was to believe that Donald Trump had been defrauded of an electoral win. You would have to believe that somehow the ballots were monkeyed with in a way that impacted only the presidential election and not all of the other elections on the ballot, right? And you guys get it. If we're talking about detecting when we're being lied to, for me that feels very much game over. We need to do a better job of telling the truth to people. You know, Trump is very good at getting narratives in circulation. We need to float those counter narratives early and often. The good news, I think, and this is a great question, we know it's coming. How do we prepare for it? The groups in our communities that have traditionally litigated and supported voting, groups like the Legal Defense Fund or the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, they are actively thinking about these issues. Civil society groups are working on them. But ultimately, again, we can get resources from them. They will certainly lead the way in some places. This is something for all of us to think about now. Who do you know in your sphere of influence that's vulnerable to this sort of stuff? Because I promise you that to the people around you, they view you and your opinion as far more important to their decision-making process than some folks in Washington or some talking heads on TV. And if you're the one that talks with them and says, these allegations of fraud don't make sense, because what about all of these other races on the ballot? Or, you know, just because, like, do y'all remember the whole Dominion voting machines nonsense? And it was just so easy to debunk. So put yourself in the role of debunker and take this on as one of your missions.
There's also, in the very same vein, there's comfort in the fact that our elections are run by local officials. And it turns out that 92% of Americans, year after year after year after year, 2018, 20, 22, 24, trust their local election officials to run free and fair elections because they do. It's only those elections over there run by them that are fraudulent, with heavy quotes around every part of that sentence. But it turns out that reality lives locally. And local election officials of both parties and neither are very dedicated to running elections that are free and fair and then telling people about them. So we'll know who wins, we'll know who loses, the election officials will tell us, and you can believe your local election officials. I'm telling you, here in LA County, we have a wonderful registrar. In the neighboring counties, there are wonderful registrars. In counties across the country, there are registrars who, for their citizens, for their constituencies, they just want to see the elections run fairly.
Something that's remarkably effective in this regard is actually giving people access to understanding how elections are run and ballots are counted. You know, it's easy to have this mythology of fraud if you don't know how it works. But there are some states where the Secretary of State runs educational programs that let people come and look and watch. And so, for instance, in Maine, their Secretary of State, Shanna Bellows, has told me that she's had people come in who are very worried about fraud in the wake of 2016 and 2020. And once they see how ballots are distributed, taken in, counted, and secured, that they walk away with an entirely different attitude. I mean, educating people about the process really does work, to Justin's point.
And serving as a poll worker does all of that tenfold.
What side are we on?
Over
I
here,
apologize
sir.
for not understanding either of these topics very well, but could Trump use either a state of emergency or the Insurrection Act last minute, like he likes to move quickly before the courts can address this, could use either one of those things to physically intervene with troops, physically preventing people from voting?
Well, he's certainly been floating the test balloons to see how feasible that is. You know, Trump has stopped short of actually invoking the Insurrection Act. And instead, he's been using one of the statutes that sort of enables a president to federalize troops. That's why there have been National Guard troops here and elsewhere. And so it's pretty interesting, these statutes, which have been around for a long time, and which let a president mobilize troops, federalize them, bring them in 3 situations. If there's an invasion, there hadn't been, there probably won't be. If there's a rebellion, not seeing any rebellions. And so we have this nebulous third hook, this notion of civil unrest that's so extreme that the president can no longer enforce federal law with existing forces. That's the issue that the Supreme Court is about to decide. You know, if the court does its job, that will be the end of the inquiry, right? If the court says, we have the ability to review and you can't send in troops unless there truly is a situation, we will not have that in advance of the election. Something that we've seen from people who believe in democracy is incredible discipline. 7 to 8 million Americans out protesting for no kings, and no significant violent incidents, certainly nothing. And so what we worry about is this: what happens if the Supreme Court doesn't firmly slap down the president? And if we're in a setting where he might have an argument for doing it, and as you point out, he tends to just go into the breach, right? He does not wait. That's why it's so important to have governors in the states, attorneys general in the states, who are prepared to respond as swiftly as we have seen people like Pritzker do. And you know, a lot of the pushback that happened there, and the real education and the information where America, I mean, I'm telling y'all, I get people who send me pictures of what's happening in Portland, Oregon just about every day. The flower markets, the peaceful streets. And there's this awareness that really makes hash of any sort of an effort to do that. And even if the courts don't firmly tell Trump no, even if he gets a partial no with this go-round, what that means is that in states and localities where government and local officials are strong, they will still be able to go into the courts to put an immediate hold on this sort of business in advance of the elections. There will be hypersensitivity to this issue by the time we get to the midterms. Even if the issues aren't fully untangled, something that we saw the Supreme Court do in the wake of 2020 was to actually weigh in on the side of voters and elections. And it would be pretty raw and rank for a president to try to put troops on the streets in advance of a hotly contested election on the pretense that there was incitement going on the streets when it was plain to everybody that it was not. I'm not confident about a whole lot with the courts these days. I think that they'll protect the elections.
And there are two other very quick points, I promise I will make this quick, that are directly related. One, the courts are more powerful than you think they are. And there may be this weird and profoundly ahistorical, profoundly unconstitutional immunity for the president, but the president doesn't act alone, and that immunity doesn't extend to any other individual. If a court issues an order that isn't followed, that court has the ability to bankrupt the non-follower forever and immediately. There are real teeth that the courts can use if they want. They haven't so far, but they stand there. And I think that's part of why you haven't seen this administration send in the troops to Portland or send in the troops to Chicago, where there's plenty of chaos, but not military, because the courts have said no and they've listened. The other point is to national emergencies. This is deeply inaccessible to people who aren't lawyers. National emergencies are triggers in particular statutes for particular things. They're not magical incantations. We do not live in a Harry Potter world where you just say national emergency in Latin and stuff happens. So,
Well, that's Trump's view, right?
It is.
You can't review my decisions.
but there is no statute that lets you declare a national emergency around elections. None. Zero. And so I declare a national emergency for Donald Trump has exactly as much legal relevance in the election context as if I wrote on a bedsheet, I declare a national emergency and hung it outside my window. It means nothing. Or, if you prefer, it has as much legal relevance as the phrase unicorn flatulence, which you will not find in a statute anywhere. So he's fond of pretending he has this authority in order to convince us that he has this authority. We don't have to listen when the emperor doesn't actually have any clothes on.
You know, and beyond that, there are specific statutory prohibitions, for instance, for deploying the military too close to a polling place. And so there are all of these legal protections that we have not really had to think about and talk about in court because no president has done this before. But that's not to say that they aren't there and that they wouldn't come into play and be effective in a worst-case scenario. I think the real wisdom here, though, is that Trump is testing. He's trying to see what he can get away with. You know, what is it that was popular a little while ago? Taco. Trump always chickens out. We're going to see him chicken out on this, too.
Sir?
The National Guard is still here in town. Hegseth is floating the idea that the Guard should stay in D.C. through February. Beyond that, they may need to stay until the mission is accomplished, which is pretty open-ended. I'm concerned about the tension between a Supreme Court giving undue deference to the executive along with the response from Andrew Jackson. You know, Justice Marshall has given his opinion. Now let him try to enforce it. Please comment.
I mean, this is the moment that everyone has been concerned about. What happens if we go from the sort of environment that we're living in where the administration doesn't flagrantly violate court orders, it just says, well, we think that we're in compliance, right? You all remember the moment during the deportations where Judge Boasberg in the District of Columbia orders that the planes be turned around, and the government's response is, well, we didn't think that we had to because they were out of U.S. airspace, so we didn't think it applied. It was really thin. I would not be the Justice Department lawyer that would go into court and say that to a federal judge. What the administration hasn't done yet it hasn't, said, of course, that the Andrew Jackson is, I think, not maybe accurate that he said that, but the sentiment behind it, the notion that the Supreme Court can say whatever it wants to say, but that the president doesn't have to follow along, that would be a decision point in American history. And one of the reasons that it didn't happen during the deportation cases is that Republicans in Congress had a little bit of a pulse, something that we have not seen out of them too frequently. And there is this feeling, right, that you do have to obey court orders, that we're all involved in this prolonged game of democracy, and every administration is a different hand in the game. And if you blow up one hand, if you just get so mad that you're willing to blow up the entire game just to win one hand, that democracy ends. And there are, believe it or not, still Republicans who don't want to blow up the whole game. They want to stick around and continue to be in the Senate, or they like this country. Whatever their motivation is, there are some outer edges at which people will push back. You know, the supine Congress has been a feature of our landscape. But on Twitter, that most unlikely of places for serious legal conversations to happen, we have seen senators and others talk about the importance of complying with court orders. I think that there are just enough of them to make that happen.
So I was getting a cue. I wasn't sure whether that was 2 questions or 2 minutes.
2 questions.
2 questions.
I'm sorry, because there's Joyce and Justin are so indulgent and fabulously gracious, and this could go on for hours and hours. But Joyce
We'll come
has
back.
been, Joyce has been on planes and all that, and so we're going to have 2 more questions. Okay, my brother's going to yell at me because he's the third, and I'm sorry, Bob. I'm sorry, Bob.
And I'll tell you, everybody who is more than second in line, the answer is right in the back of the book.
Okay, so we're going to take these questions and these last 2 questions, and Joyce will sign books in the lobby. Okay, so have at it, make them good.
On
Sir.
a lighter note, thank you for your chicken pictures.
Thank you.
And on a little bit more somber note, almost all of the chicken pictures has Bella calm as a guardian over all of this insanity. Is there a secret lesson that Bella can teach us?
I have asked this very question of Joyce years ago. No, it's true. This is 100% true.
Yeah. So this is my German Shepherd, Bella, protector of our flock of chickens, the sweetest dog in the whole universe. You know, we need a few Bellas in Congress. It's a shame that we don't have them. So maybe we should vote for those kind of folks in the next election. But thank you so much for your kind words. We became pandemic chicken owners just to indulge one of our kids. And there's a serious point here, which is that things that bring you joy, things that make you happy, even if they're as silly as having ornamental chickens running around in your backyard, you know, indulge yourselves. We need those moments right now to keep ourselves going.
Could you speak a little bit about the upcoming Supreme Court case on voting rights and how you see that going? And if it doesn't go as we would hope, what tools do we have to mitigate the results of it?
So this is Calais, the Louisiana gerrymandering case. Do you want to start, and then I'll say stuff after you?
Sure. This case is tremendously important. It shouldn't be. This case started out last year as a really easy case, where the question was, did Louisiana draw a second congressional district because of race or politics? And the answer was, they wanted to protect the Speaker of the House's seat. They wanted to protect Steve Scalise's seat. This is not a hard question. This was politics all the way through. They knew they had to draw a district somewhere, but that's not enough to invalidate anything. I thought this was a super easy case. Justice Thomas thought this was a super easy case from exactly the opposite direction. That led to some difficulties, where it's now become apparently a harder case with an awful lot at stake. One version of things, and the version you'll probably hear most often in the public, is that the Supreme Court may be poised to say you can't consider race at all whenever you're doing anything but also drawing district lines. The last justice to sit on the court who actually drew district lines was Justice O'Connor, who went through 3 redistrictings in her time in the Arizona Senate, and she knew that it is impossible to unsee community. When you know who people are, you can't get rid of that thought. So it is, as she recognized, impossible to not consider race in the process, just like you consider a whole bunch of other things that you know about the community. I don't think the court is going to go that far. to go that far would effectively mean holding a constitutional amendment unconstitutional. It's very awkward to say that part of the Constitution is unconstitutional. I don't think they'll go that far. I do think that they will find a way to further cut back, as we've seen them further cut back. Not that long ago, 12 years ago, they issued a case in Shelby County that talked a lot about constitutional stuff and then went right up to the line and said, we're not going to go all the way there, but we're going to take away this one piece that's really important. And I think they may be poised to do something similar, which is take away a piece that ends up really important. How do we protect ourselves if they do that? First of all, don't think of it as a foregone conclusion. 2 years ago, we were in the same place waiting for the Supreme Court to issue a decision on voting rights that could have been really bad, and they came back, case out of Alabama. They came back and said, yeah, you know what, we've had some time to think about it. You're doing it fine. Last year, they had a case out of North Carolina where they could have said that nobody but the state legislature gets to decide anything about congressional districts at all. That would have been a disaster for a whole bunch of reasons. They looked over the edge. Chief Justice Roberts had taken this position 9 years ago, and so everybody thought that was a foregone conclusion. They looked over the edge and they said, no, actually, the way we've been doing things is fine. So the possibility of the way we've been doing things is fine is still very much out there. This could still end up an easy case. If it's not easy, we're going to need to tell our representatives what we want out of representation. So it's going to take exactly what Joyce talks about in the book of us letting the people who ostensibly work for us know that we want a different representational system. There are still plenty of ways, plenty of tools, plenty of statutes, federal and state, that can help make sure that communities get represented, including communities of color, get represented, even if the Supreme Court takes away a really important lever in the heart of the Voting Rights Act. What exactly that looks like depends a little bit on what they say, but we got plenty of tools left to make sure if we speak loud enough that we get represented as we wish.
So I think speaking loudly and being informed on this issue is the key. Let me just zoom out a little bit, because now you know what you need to know about this case out of Louisiana. In Shelby County versus Holder, a case out of my district, the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And what that meant, it was an enormous loss. It's hard to explain in some ways, but if you think of it like this, you'll understand. Section 5 let lawyers go to court, and when some state or locality passed a bad new law or was trying to put into place a practice that would have suppressed people's voting rights, the lawyers could go to court before the bad thing happened and get the court to say, no, you can't do that. And when we lost Section 5, we lost that powerful tool. And the Chief Justice said, but you still have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was largely used at that point in time to go after efforts to gerrymander, right? To draw, you've all seen them, these crazy congressional districts where state legislatures would try to create one district and stuff every black voter in the state that they could into it, and then spread them out amongst the remainder so that they had no realistic opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. Lawyers, I think, call that cracking and packing, right? Packing black voters into one district and cracking, spreading them out through the rest of them. And so after the Shelby County decision, there were efforts to use Section 2 more aggressively to protect voting rights, to go beyond gerrymanders. But the problem with Section 2 is that you can't use it in advance like you could Section 5. You primarily had to go to court after the bad thing was happening and ask a court to stop it. But it's still impactful. And at stake in this case is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. I think we need to tell the Supreme Court no. And the way we do that, you know, Supreme Court justices aren't the only ones who have the power of dissent in this country. We can dissent too. We do it at the ballot box. If we believe that these decisions are bad in 2026, then Americans should return clear congressional majorities and demand that those candidates commit in advance to restoring the Voting Rights Act. Because just because Yeah. Just because the Supreme Court has said that as written there are flaws, they've in fact, with Section 5, given the Congress guidance on what it could do to fix that. It's a matter of political will. That's us telling Congress and the courts what we want. And that, I think, is a great place for us to stop, because I hope what that gives you all is a sense that really we do have a lot more power than this president wants us to think we have. It's up to us to exercise it.
And we have to speak loud, everybody. Joyce, thank you. Justin, thank you. And Joyce will be in the lobby and she'll sign books. Thank you.